It is great to see y'all out. I'm going to cut right to the chase this morning. We've got a long ways to go and a short time to get there, and that's both the motto of the lesson and the reality of our lesson this morning. Is today we're going to be talking about redeeming the time. Now, I want you to go ahead and grab your Bibles out, if you would, and be opening up to the book of Ephesians, chapter 5, and we're going to be looking specifically in that chapter at verses 15 down through verse number 17. There is something that we all need to recognize, and it's kind of one of those things that is a touchy subject with all of us, but there is a reality that time flies. If you've ever been to Kensington Gardens over in London, England, there's a clock that each side of the clock faces one different direction, and underneath it, carved into the stone, are the words, time flies, so that no matter what direction you're looking at this clock, you have the reminder that time is fleeting. It is something that is going. It is something that no matter which direction you look from, it is inescapable that time is constantly moving. As you open up in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 through 17, you understand that this is the exact same thing that Paul is talking about as he's going to begin talking to the church at Ephesus. But there's one thing we have to establish before we realize and read this text, and that is what we are told in Psalm chapter 90 and verse number 10. Moses writes there, "The days of our years are 80 years and 10, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away." That same idea of time flying, we fly away. That same picture as used here in the garden of that clock is the picture that Moses gives us, and he gives us a very sobering reminder, and he gives us a direct number to look at. He gives us the number 70. You know, if you stop and you think about that for a moment, a modern life, if you were to look up America's average mortality rate as far as how long our lifespans are today, I think we've reached about 79 years as the average. And some people are blessed to live longer than that. Some are not fortunate enough to make it close to that. But as an average, we have an average of about 70 to 80 years of our life. As Moses continues reading on that, he says, if you make it to 80, you're doing really good. And as Americans, we're fortunate enough to be able to look at our lifespan. But if you stop for a second and you consider that we have 70 years as what the book tells us, what are we spending that 70 years of our life doing? Well, I can tell you we can account for a lot of that. If you take this number, and let's just for time's sake, just say we're going to use this as a round number and say this is the years of our life that we have to spend. Out of those 70 years, did you know that we will spend 23 years asleep? If we go off the average statistics today, we'll spend about 11 years of that 70 years looking at a smartphone, about 8 years looking at a television. We'll spend 6 years eating, about 6 years in traffic, and if we attend every Sunday morning, every Sunday evening, and every Wednesday evening Bible class, we will spend in our total of 70 years about 6 months in worship to God. Now, if you do the math of that, that's not an accusation to be made. That's just the reality that you and I have about 42 years of a 70-year life already spent doing things that we just typically find ourselves doing. 42 years of it spent, 23 of those years are literally just spent sleeping away. Now, with that being a reminder, that is before we ever take our time to read the Bible, before we ever have that conversation maybe we're holding out on, maybe before we ever get to comfort somebody, before we do any of those things, there are set times and set things that we have a reality around. Now, I don't say that at all to be accusatory. It's just simply a mirror. And here's the reality of that, and this is going to freak a lot of people out. I don't say it to do that. It's just in terms of how relative and the question of are we spending our time well. Do you realize if the average lifespan, and as Moses is writing that, he says is 70 years, do you realize what we call middle age is probably not actually middle age? You realize whenever you hit 35 that you're talking more middle age there? That's going to freak a lot of people out. It's not supposed to, but if we do that, we understand just how short and valuable our time is then, don't we? And if we're calling what we have time and thinking we have more time to spend, we have to be careful and cautious that we are actually choosing to spend our time wisely. Out of all of that time we spend, 6 months of an entire life typically is spent in the worship of our Lord. And so under Paul's clock in Ephesus, there is a reality that time is constantly flying, that time is constantly moving, and if we understand that it is moving, we will understand how valuable it is that we choose to spend our time wisely. So find yourself with me in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 through 17. And Paul here is writing to the church at Ephesus, and he says, "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Wherefore be ye not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is." Now, if you stop at the end of verse 17, you will recognize right off the bat that there are three commands stacked right on top of each other. The first of which is to walk circumspectly. The second is to redeem the time. And then he finishes and tells us that we are to understand the will of the Lord. And as you read that, you understand he's not coming from a place of suggestion. He's not coming from a place that if we have time. He is saying these are three commands that if we are going to serve God wisely, if we are going to serve God as Christians ought, then we're going to pay attention as to how exactly we are using our time. And so what exactly is he talking about with these words? You know, we say this and we've read this passage a lot. What exactly does any of this mean, though? Well, if we break it down and consider what these things mean, the word and the idea of redeem means to buy back out of the market. Now, that means a couple of things for us. It means that you are going to purchase it out of the hands of somebody already using it. Now, what that means is that time is not neutral. It is being used whether we like it or not. It is a commodity that is not static. It is constantly moving and running out. And the longer that we wait to buy it, the less there will be of it. It is running out. And so he tells us that we are to redeem. That means to buy back. Whenever Paul says in Galatians 3:13, and he says there, "Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law," bought back us from the curse of the law. That means that we were sold to something and now he has bought us back. And as Paul is reading this and he's telling the church at Ephesus, he's saying, listen, time is owned by something. It is being spent. In order for us to redeem it, that means that we take it out of where it currently is and we begin using it for ourselves and for God. But it is not something that we are going to be able to wait and have the same amount of. The longer we wait to redeem it, the less of it there will be because somebody else is using it. So he tells the church specifically, and he tells you and I to look circumspectly. And what that means is that you look around carefully. He's not saying you and I as Christians are walking around in paranoia. We're not walking around worried in that sense. No, he's saying you pay attention. With what I do in the secular world, we have a lot of job sites. There's a lot of heavy things overhead. Whether you're doing steel or trusses and you've got cranes and telehandlers, you get all these things overhead. And whenever you walk onto a job site, you're looking around circumspectly. That means you're paying attention and you're looking around carefully because there's danger around. That's what Paul's saying here. He says, don't be paranoid, but pay attention. Because there are things around you that are going to bite you if you're not careful. And so as you're looking around, be awake. And so he tells Christians, you and I are to be awake. And then he says something that stops us in our tracks. Because you keep reading there through verse number 15, and what does he go on to say? See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time. And then he says, because the days are evil. Now, if you stop for a second and you let that sink in and you think about what he has just said, he doesn't soften it. He doesn't even qualify it. He just says the days are evil. Not that they're difficult, not that they are challenging, not that they are complicated. He says specifically there, the days are evil. I'll sit with that for a minute before we go any further. What does it mean for the days to be evil? And he doesn't say the days may become evil. He says the days are evil. And if the days are evil, this is, if you put it in perspective, written to a church whose congregation and whose hometown is sitting in the same place that serves with the Temple of Diana. You have all of these commerce done by pagan ideals. The entertainment was as vile as we can get today, whose culture is bent every single direction away from godly living. And as you understand where he is writing it, you also understand that the days of Ephesus, he's not just talking to Ephesus, he's talking to Gospel Hill, he's talking to Christians here in this congregation. He's saying the days are evil, not just for them, but for all of us. And so, if the days are evil, you need to buy those hours back. You need to be choosing to do something that is worthwhile with your time instead of watching it go to waste and watching it go away. You know, as Moses is in the wilderness, we read Psalm 90 a second ago. Psalm 90, if you go and you consider the words of Psalm 90, this is a prayer of Moses, the man of God. That's the superscription of Psalm 90. It is the oldest psalm in the book. It is given by a man who at this point is 120 years old and who has just watched an entire generation of people die in the wilderness because they chose to spend their time wasting it by complaining, by murmuring, by choosing to do anything else other than serving God. Every single grave that Moses is walking past belonged to a person who was supposed to enter into the land of Canaan and did not, because they chose to waste their time. And so whenever he tells us, and whenever he gives us a description, whenever Moses says to teach us to number our days, he's not being poetic, he is preaching a funeral. And he says, because look at these people, they did not. They did not recognize how important their days were. They did not recognize how important their time is. And so the driving question for you and I is, whose hours are these that we have? Whose days are these that we have? Every Christian in this congregation, every Christian across the world was bought with a price. 1 Corinthians 6:20 tells us that very plainly. We are bought with a price. The hands were bought, the mouths were bought, the eyes were bought. That means our hours are bought as well. That means that I owe somebody something because I was bought back as a Christian. Whose hours are these? Do they belong to me or they belong to God? And see, the question this morning, it is not how much more time do I have? That's not the question we're going to be asking. The question is, whose hours are these? Whose days are these? Who do they truly belong to? And so that leads us into our second part of this, where we consider and ask the hard question, where's the time actually going? And we had the statistic a second ago as we're considering all the years we spend sleeping in traffic, eating, all of these other things. But I'm talking about the years and the days that we have in outside of those things. Where are we actually spending our time? Paul says the days are evil. That means that if the days are evil, there are real thieves at work. Not imaginary ones, not ones that we can think of. There are three thieves we can talk about and name very specifically this morning that we see men from Scripture struggling with. Can we say that perhaps today a thief that many of us struggle with is the screen? Can we say that perhaps it has become one of the greatest thieves of our time? If I were to ask you to pull out your phone or your device with me and you looked at the average screen time that you had this past week, it's scary how often and how much time we spend on our devices and on the screen. You know, the average American today spends between 7 to 11 hours on their screen. And that's just a reality of how it is. And that's talking about in between as well with work and understanding we do spend a lot of time with it because of our jobs and the nature of them today at work. But we also spend a lot of time not at work, don't we? We also spend a lot of time looking at things and doing things that perhaps we shouldn't be. If you think about this, if I'm actually spending 7 to 11 hours of my day, let's go on the low end of that. Let's just say 8 hours of my day. And I know that I'm going to spend, and probably some are going to be quite a bit less than 8 hours sleeping. Am I really spending half of my waking day? And this is what I'm doing. Now, with that in mind and that reality in mind, the psalmist says in Psalm 101, verse 3, I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes. Now, here's what I want us to understand. Is it just bad, the nature of the screen? Is it inherently an evil thing? No, I don't think we can make the argument that in and of itself it is inherently an evil thing. But what are we choosing to spend our time on? Even if we're choosing to spend our time on things that aren't by themselves, we can argue, sinful, I think what we find happens is that the more time we spend behind the screen instead of at work and in the work of the church and of the gospel and just in our general work as people in the world today, I think what we find is the algorithm returns a softer man. maybe not necessarily a more sinful man by how we would define it, but a softer man, maybe a more distracted man, maybe a less prayerful man, maybe just a little bit of a different man than he started. In Joshua chapter 7, verse 21, there's a man that we are introduced to by the name of Achan. And Achan is a guy who kind of gives us a perfect illustration of what this means to find himself distracted. In Joshua 7, verse 21, it says, "When I saw among the spoils a goodly Babylonian garment." I want you to look at that first part. What is the first thing that he did? He says, "I saw them." The text goes on, it says, "Then I coveted them and took them, and behold, they are hid in the earth in the midst of my tent." 4 verbs there. You hear them and you see them? I saw, I coveted, I took, I hid. That is the entire story of what an unguarded eye does. That is the entire story of what the screen can do to us if we are not careful. And so he says, and what happens here is he goes and he buries the garment in his tent. Now, if you don't know who Achan is, he is the man responsible for not only the loss of his life, the loss of also his family's life, the loss of also the army's life, and also, the downfall of the siege of Ai. That he was responsible for so much other than just his own grievance. If you consider the saint who buries the screen under the pillow at night, we can be running the same play, and we can become so distracted by it that we are doing the same thing Achan is doing and seeing and coveting to the point that we are pursuing it with no other purpose than just pursuing. I mean, honestly, what are we truly looking at? Now, I don't think we're going to go out of here today, and I doubt we're going to radically change our lives as a result of a sermon, but that's all I ask is just to look at ourselves and say, what am I really doing with my time? And if I really do only have this amount of time here, listen, life is short. And if we consider that I've got 70 years, I've got 70 summers to go through, 70 autumns, 70 winters, that I may have 70 springs. And I start looking at it that way, it becomes a lot shorter, especially when it comes with how much time I have to spend with my kids while they're little, and as they grow up, and with my spouse, with my parents, and with my grandparents. That time we spend, it becomes much shorter about our friends and our family that's around us. And so if I understand that, what am I going to do with my time? It can sure take a lot of our time away if we are spending it behind the screen. The second thief that we see that can steal so much of our time is the grievance. And here's what we mean by that. It's not necessarily the screen, but it's the replay. It is living into the past so much that that's all we ever do, and that's the only place that we ever stay. Maybe somebody said something to you 3 years ago. Maybe it was a comment at a family reunion. Maybe it was somebody who a brother did to you. But a grievance is something that lives rent-free in our head. It is a rent-free tenant. And it is not paying, and it moves the mind, and it continues us to cause us to work, and it ultimately pays nothing, but it charges us for every hour it's there because it's taking our time. And if it's taking our time for that, then we're not able to use it for something else. Do you think of any men in the Bible that have had this problem? In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul says to the church at Ephesus here in verses 31 and 32, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you." When Paul says this, he says for it to be put away, not managed, not processed, not understood. No, you put it away, because if you don't, it will eat you and it will eat your time alive. In Genesis chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, we're introduced to Cain in the field, and we're told, "Sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him." Keep reading. It says, "And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him." The thing about Cain, we got to realize, Cain did not start at murder. Cain started at grievance. This is a grievance that God himself was confronting him. It was knocking at the door in verse 7. He says, it is not going to lead to anything good. That grievance was small enough to swallow. You realize that? Cain could have moved on with his life. He could have chosen to redeem his time. He could have chosen to be a proper servant to God. He had every opportunity to do so, but it ate him alive to the point where it grew. And the next thing we read is in verse number 8, where he goes out into a field and kills his brother. Every second we spend relitigating in our head what happened in the past is time that is stolen from the now and from the future. And that's exactly what Cain did. The Hebrew writer says in chapter 2, in looking at verse number 1, talking about the third and final thief of the drift. He says, "Therefore we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest at any time we should let them slip." See, let's think about the drift for a second and what the drift is. The drift is quieter than the other two. It's simply drifting away. It's not the sin of adultery. It's not something that we may say is something volatile or something that everybody can see, but drift is the loss of intention. And it is the forgetting of how valuable our time is. It is pushing and kicking the can down the road on things we know we need to do, but ultimately not taking the time to do it. That's why when we read Hebrews chapter 2 and verse number 1, whenever he talks about letting them slip, that idea of being slip, it means drifting past the harbor. It means that not necessarily to be shipwrecked, not to sink. No, it just means you're drifting away. You're drifting away from what is important. This is the saint who chooses to do nothing with his time. The current is going to move us out whether we like it or not. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 16, we're told about a man who drifted away from his purpose, who drifted away from his intention. Hebrews 12:16 talks about this man. It says, "Lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright." You think about how easy that was and what Esau gave up by simply drifting away with his purpose. One meal. He had one week afternoon. And as a result of that, it was one decision that he could never take back. Esau goes, and as you continue reading there, by the way, in Hebrews 12, the next verse says, "He found no place of repentance, though he sought it carefully with tears." The trade he made in that moment was final. It was something he could not buy back. Every drift is a small trade at the time. It's a small trade that we are making, a morsel of scrolling instead of praying, a morsel of resentment instead of peace at home, a morsel of later for the invitation God is calling us for. It's a morsel of waiting, and it's small at the time, but it's time we will never get back. We're told of another man in the New Testament. Acts 24, verse 25 tells us about a man who said, "Go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee." Felix the governor sat in front of Paul as he's preaching, and he's trembling, and he says this. He says, when he has a convenient season, does that season ever come? Are we ever any less busy, it seems like? It seems like the only thing we ever get is more busy. And we spend more time. The very last recorded conversation that Felix ever has in Scripture is this one. And the last words that he ever says to the Apostle Paul is, "Whenever I have a convenient season, I'll call for you." We're never told that he came. Later is the language of drifting away, of the thief of that drift. Later is the sentence of a man speaking to God for the very last time that God speaks to him. Later. 4 men, 4 hours spent. Achan under his tent, Cain in his field, Esau at his bowl, Felix in his hall. 4 men, 4 thieves, 4 hours and pieces of time that these men did not give back. For you and me, which thief is winning? Which thief is the one that we have that is losing and causing us to spend all of our time? Is it the screen? Is it the grievance? Is it the drift? What exactly is the one winning? One of these 3 things has our life in its hands. And so the message for you and I this morning is to actually buy it back. Is to actually take this time and do something with it instead of watching it go away. When Moses says in Psalm 90:12, "So teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." He does not tell us and does not pray, and listen to me really carefully, he does not pray that we have more days. He says, pay attention to the time that we do have so that we can apply our hearts to the wisdom and to wisdom, the wisdom of the Word. Paul will write to the Ephesians, "Wherefore be ye not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. Number the days first, then understand our will and understand God's will and what His will is for us. Understand what it is that I am supposed to be doing in this life, because I only have a short period of time. I only have a small period of time before it's gone away. The world is filled with graves of people who said, later, or one more day, or I'll do that tomorrow. Of people that woke up this morning and thought they would. Tomorrow they're going to have plans, but they're not going to live to see it. We have to be wise in understanding the time we have, the hours and what they are for, and that we choose to do in Ecclesiastes 9:10, that whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might, for there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave, whither thou goest. I want to tell you one story before we close, and that's the story of the man that God gave 15 more years to. Hezekiah was a man that lay on his deathbed, and he turned his face to the wall and he was weeping. And he's in this situation where he wants more time, and he's begging for more time. And whenever he does, God gives him 15 more years, gives him a gift. And you know, we always talk about Hezekiah in the story. This is, by the way, a quantity of time no one else in the Old Testament ever received back after it was measured out. Nobody else has ever said to get this. Now the question is, what exactly did Hezekiah do with those 15 years extra that he had? Do you know, Hezekiah showed the treasures of the house of the Lord to the ambassadors of Babylon. And as a result of so many things he did in that 15 years, lost the kingdom of his son in the trade. You know, this one thing to have more time, it's another thing to redeem it properly. That's in Isaiah 38, verse 5. I have heard thy prayer, I have seen thy tears. Behold, I will add unto thy days 15 years. 15 years is what God gave. The kingdom of Judah is what Hezekiah gave back because he chose not to redeem them well. How much time has God given to me and you? The question for us is not, will you get more time? The question is, what will I do with this time that I already have? What will I do in redeeming this time? What will this next hour be spent on? What will this next day be spent on? You see, the importance for you and I is that we choose to do something now. We choose to do something so that we can say at the end, we gave all the time we had and all our effort in redeeming it the way that God said. Now, maybe you're one this morning and you realized, I've wasted a lot of time. I think all of us probably realize that at one time or another, how much time that we waste, all of those things that we choose to do. When you think back to Paul's commands, the days are evil, the book is open, the hours are his. If I have chosen to waste time, there is nothing I can do to get back that which is already gone. But all I can do today is look at the time I have in front of me, redeem it and buy it back, and use it for the way that God intends. So what does the Lord own of this coming week that he did not own of the last one? Who owns my time, and who is going to get the majority of what I spend it with? See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Wherefore be ye not unwise, but understanding that the will of the Lord is. So the question is, if you are outside of Christ, the most redeemable hour of your life is the next one. If you are one who is a child of God and you're living in sin and it's unconfessed and you're still living in this, you're drifting away, maybe it's a grievance that's unforgiven, maybe you're spending too much time elsewhere, then this morning come. The days are evil. The door is open. The book is true. This morning, if we can help you in any way, the invitation is now. What are we doing with our time? And what will you do with this invitation today? If we can help you at all, please come forward as together we stand and sing this song of encouragement.